Mark grabbed my carved oak walking stick and hurled it into the roaring fireplace before I could react or stop him. The flames licked hungrily at the wood I'd shaped with my own weathered hands after hip surgery, left me needing constant support for balance. "There," he said with that cruel smirk I'd seen far too often lately, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction at my shock. "Now you can stop pretending to be helpless and do my chores like you're supposed to, old man." The stick crackled and popped as it burned, and I watched 20 years of careful carving turn to ash and smoke before my horrified eyes. My chest tightened with something between pure heartbreak and blazing rage that threatened to consume me. The walking stick wasn't just wood to me. It was my independence, my dignity, my connection to the skilled craftsman I used to be before age caught up with me. Mark represented everything wrong with today's entitled youth. Lazy, cruel, expecting everything without consequences or respect for their elders. As Mark slouched back toward his expensive video games, I made a silent promise that would change both our lives forever in ways he couldn't imagine. He would learn exactly who he was dealing with, and the lesson would be unforgettable. "The driveway needs shoveling right now," Mark announced the next freezing morning, pointing lazily at the snow-covered concrete with casual authority while staying warm inside. "Since you burned my walking stick, how exactly do you expect me to manage that heavy work?" I asked quietly, testing the true depth of his emerging cruelty toward me. He shrugged with practiced indifference, already turning his back on me dismissively. "Figure it out yourself, old man. That's really not my problem anymore, is it?" I watched him return confidently to his comfortable gaming chair, expensive controller in hand, while I struggled painfully into my worn winter coat with trembling, arthritic fingers. Each scrape of the metal shovel sent sharp lightning bolts through my damaged hip, radiating burning pain down my entire left leg with every movement. Neighbors walking their morning dogs stopped and stared as I worked alone in the bitter cold, my labored breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. Mrs. Henderson from directly across the street looked absolutely horrified seeing a 74-year-old man clearing heavy snow while his healthy teenage grandson played games inside the warm house. The shame burned hotter than my aching muscles, cutting deeper than the harsh winter wind against my face. But I was learning something valuable about my grandson's true character, lessons that would soon work against him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. When I told my daughter Melissa exactly what her son had done to me, she barely looked up from her glowing laptop screen, fingers still typing frantically at endless work emails. "Dad, you're being overly dramatic about this whole situation. It was just a stick, and boys will be boys, you know that." Her casual dismissal hit me like a devastating physical blow to the chest, knocking the wind from my lungs. Just a stick? That precious walking stick had been my lifeline since the painful surgery, carved lovingly from oak I'd personally salvaged from my old workplace when the factory closed down permanently after 40 years. He threw it deliberately in the fire, Melissa. Then he forced me to shovel the entire driveway while he played games comfortably inside. She sighed heavily with obvious irritation, the sound of someone completely tired of listening to complaints she didn't want to hear or deal with. "Mark's going through a difficult teenage phase right now, Dad. Don't take his behavior personally." As she returned immediately to her typing, clicking keys with annoying precision and focus, I realized with growing horror that my daughter had completely failed to raise a respectful son through years of poor parenting choices and constant enabling. She'd encouraged his cruelty through endless excuse-making and deliberately avoiding any real consequences for his increasingly terrible behavior toward others. If she wouldn't address Mark's behavior with proper discipline and boundaries, I would handle this situation myself using methods she'd never approve of or understand. Some crucial lessons couldn't wait for convenient timing or parental permission from anyone. That quiet night, I sat alone in my cluttered workshop staring thoughtfully at the old chest tucked carefully beneath a dusty canvas tarp in the forgotten corner. Inside lay the precious tools and keepsakes from my 40 dedicated years as a skilled machinist, including 3 other walking sticks I'd crafted over the years with meticulous precision and care. Each one told a completely different story of my life, my hard-earned skills, my stubborn determination to remain independent despite advancing age and increasing physical injury. Mark foolishly thought he'd stripped away my mobility by burning one stick, but he'd only revealed his complete ignorance about who he was actually dealing with here. I lifted the heaviest cane carefully, feeling the steel core I'd personally welded inside the solid oak shaft years ago when arthritis first started seriously affecting my balance and stability on uneven ground. This wasn't just a simple walking aid. It was a potential weapon if needed, a tool forged by a man who understood both raw physical strength and patient strategic timing perfectly. The substantial weight felt reassuring in my weathered hands, familiar and comforting like greeting an old friend after years apart. Mark had made his first serious mistake by completely underestimating me and my capabilities. I was already planning to make sure it would be his last mistake for a very long time to come. The next cold morning brought another deliberate test of Mark's growing entitlement and shocking disrespect for his elders and family. He carelessly dropped an overflowing laundry basket at my feet and smirked with obvious satisfaction at my surprised reaction. "Since you don't have your precious walking stick anymore to lean on, you can bend down properly and wash my dirty clothes like you should." The casual cruelty in his voice reminded me painfully of his worthless father, my ex-son-in-law who'd selfishly abandoned Melissa when Mark was still small and vulnerable and needed a father figure. Bad blood had a way of revealing itself across generations, poisoning family relationships with pure selfishness and complete disrespect for authority and tradition. I said absolutely nothing in response, just silently gathered the dirty shirts and jeans while he washed with growing satisfaction and obvious amusement at my submission. Every bent knee sent sharp pain shooting through my damaged hip, but I endured it with growing determination and careful long-term planning. Mark mistakenly thought he was breaking me down systematically, conditioning me to serve him without question or resistance like some kind of personal servant. He had no idea whatsoever that he was actually building the case for his own reckoning and punishment. Each cruel demand was another piece of solid evidence I'd use against him when the proper time came for justice. His arrogance was digging his own grave, one humiliation at a time, deeper and deeper into trouble. That quiet evening, I entered the living room carrying my steel core walking stick, deliberately letting it tap against the hardwood floors with clear metallic authority that echoed through the house like a warning. Mark glanced up from his video game, and I caught the brief flicker of surprise and confusion across his previously smug face. "Found another crutch, huh?" he said, but his voice noticeably lacked its usual confidence and swagger completely. I settled into my favorite chair, placing the heavy stick across my lap, where he could see it clearly and examine its obvious substantial weight. The difference was obvious to anyone with eyes. This wasn't the lightweight oak he'd burned so carelessly in his arrogance. This was something more substantial, more dangerous, more purposeful in every way possible. "I made several over the years," I said quietly, letting my words sink in slowly and deliberately. A smart craftsman always has backups for important tools. Mark's eyes lingered on the stick longer than necessary, and I knew I'd planted the first important seed of doubt and uncertainty in his mind. His confidence was starting to crack, and I was just getting started with my careful education. The real lessons hadn't even begun yet, but his arrogance was already showing hairline fractures that would soon become major breaks. During dinner, I casually mentioned my old factory job, describing in vivid detail how we moved heavy machinery and worked with dangerous tools daily for decades. "Real work," I said meaningfully, "not like today's easy desk jobs." Mark snorted rudely, spraying food across his plate like an animal. I could do that stuff with my eyes closed easily. Those old guys were probably weak compared to kids today. I nodded slowly, as if considering his words seriously and giving them real thought. "You really think so? That's very interesting, Mark." Melissa looked between us nervously, sensing growing tension but missing its true source completely. I continued eating calmly, letting Mark's arrogance hang in the air like smoke from a fire. Young people always thought they were stronger, faster, better than those who came before them in previous generations. It was a mistake I'd seen countless times in the factory over 4 decades. Pride always came before the hardest falls, and Mark was setting himself up for a spectacular crash. His overconfidence would be his downfall, and I would be there to watch every moment of his humiliation. The next morning, I presented Mark with his first real physical challenge, designed to test his claims about strength. "I need help moving lumber from the shed to the workshop area." Since you're so strong, it should be easy work for someone like you." He rolled his eyes dramatically but followed me outside, eager to prove his superiority over the old man. The planks were heavy oak boards, each one weighing 60 pounds or more of solid wood. Mark grabbed the first piece confidently, muscles flexed for show, but by the second plank, sweat beaded on his forehead like morning dew. The third piece made his arms shake visibly with strain and effort. I leaned on my steel core stick, watching his struggle with scientific interest and growing amusement. "Everything okay there, Mark?" I asked mildly, hiding my satisfaction. "Fine." He grunted stubbornly, determined not to show weakness in front of his grandfather. By the fifth plank, his hands were trembling uncontrollably, and his breath came in sharp, desperate gasps. The hook was set perfectly. Now came the slow, careful reel-in that would teach him everything. Mark's frustration exploded when he dropped the sixth plank, nearly crushing his foot underneath its substantial weight. "This is stupid. Why don't you move this junk if you want it so badly?" His voice cracked with exhaustion and growing embarrassment at his failure. I let a small smile play across my lips, just enough to sting his wounded pride effectively. "I thought you said you were stronger than the old guys at the factory. Was I wrong about that?" The question hit him like a hard slap across the face. He stormed toward the house, muttering curses under his breath like a defeated child, but I knew he'd be back soon. Boys like Mark couldn't leave a challenge unanswered, especially when their grandfather was watching with obvious amusement and satisfaction. His pride would drag him back to prove himself, and when it did, I'd be ready with lesson number 2. The trap was set, and Mark would walk right into it voluntarily. His arrogance made him predictable, and predictable opponents were easy to defeat completely. That evening, I shared detailed stories from my factory days, how new workers who bragged about their strength usually lasted less than a week before quitting in defeat. The machines didn't care about your attitude or ego, I explained to Mark, who was listening despite himself. Hot steel and heavy equipment taught respect real quick to everyone. Boys who thought they knew everything got humbled fast, usually in front of everyone watching. Mark tried to look bored and uninterested, but his eyes stayed fixed on my face, absorbing every word carefully. I described accidents caused by carelessness, mistakes that cost fingers or entire careers, the difference between real strength and youthful arrogance that led nowhere good. I didn't mention that tomorrow he'd face his own version of those harsh factory lessons firsthand. Some surprises were better left unannounced until the moment of truth arrived naturally. Mark would learn the hard way, just like every other cocky kid who thought respect was optional. The factory had taught me patience, and patience would teach Mark humility, whether he wanted to learn. While the house slept peacefully, I prepared Mark's education in my workshop with military precision and attention to detail. I arranged toolboxes that required teamwork to move, set up stations that demanded both physical strength and mental patience, created tasks that would reveal the difference between confidence and actual competence. My steel core walking stick leaned against the workbench like a supervisor's baton, ready to conduct tomorrow's symphony of sweat and painful realization. Every item was positioned with specific purpose, every challenge designed to strip away another layer of Mark's false arrogance and entitlement. The workshop had taught many lessons over the years to various people, but tomorrow's would be special and memorable. Tomorrow, my grandson would discover what real work actually meant, and what happened when respect was demanded rather than assumed or taken for granted. His education was about to begin in earnest, and by the end, he'd understand exactly who his grandfather really was underneath the surface. The next morning, Mark demanded I mow the lawn despite my obvious mobility issues and physical limitations. I clutched my hip dramatically and sighed heavily. "Can't manage it with this old body, but if you help me organize the workshop first, I'll call us even on the lawn." His eyes lit up with interest. Organizing sounded easy compared to outdoor labor in the summer heat. "Deal," he said quickly, probably thinking he was outsmarting the helpless old man again. I limped toward the workshop slowly, hiding my satisfaction behind a mask of grateful weakness and dependency. Mark followed eagerly, walking straight into the carefully prepared trap I'd spent hours setting up perfectly. The workshop door closed behind us with a solid click, sealing him inside with his approaching education and reckoning. What happened next would either humble him completely or reveal just how far his arrogance had grown over the months. Either way, Mark was about to learn respect the hard way, through sweat and exhaustion. I pointed to the heavy toolboxes arranged strategically around the workshop floor. Those need to be moved to create proper workspace. Think you can handle it? Mark laughed confidently, flexing his young muscles for effect. Are you serious? This is going to be complete cake for me. He approached the first box confidently, grabbed the metal handles, and pulled with all his strength. Nothing happened at all. He adjusted his grip carefully, planted his feet firmly, and tried again with more force. The box barely budged a single inch across the concrete floor. Sweat appeared on his forehead as he strained against weight he'd completely underestimated and misjudged. I leaned against my walking stick, watching his confidence crumble with scientific fascination. Funny, I said mildly. I thought you were stronger than those factory workers I used to know personally. Mark's face flushed bright red as he realized he'd been baited into revealing his weakness in the most humiliating way possible. His arrogance had set him up perfectly for this fall from grace. By the third toolbox, Mark's shirt was completely soaked with perspiration, and his hands shook from pure physical exertion. He'd managed to move 2 boxes maybe 6 feet each, leaving him exhausted and increasingly frustrated with the situation. This is ridiculous, he panted heavily. Why do you even keep this heavy junk around? I tapped my steel core walking stick once against the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. Respect, I said simply and clearly. These tools built everything you take for granted every day. This house, your video games, the car that brings your food, all made possible by men who knew how to work properly. Mark stared at me, beginning to understand that this wasn't just about moving boxes around the workshop. His arrogance was being systematically dismantled, piece by heavy piece, and I was just getting started with his complete education. The real lessons were still coming, and he was already breaking down under the pressure of honest work. The 4th and 5th boxes broke Mark completely and utterly. He sat on the cold workshop floor, chest heaving desperately, arms hanging useless at his sides like broken wings. The cocky teenager who'd burned my walking stick had been replaced by a sweating, exhausted boy who finally understood the difference between appearance and harsh reality. I can't, he whispered hoarsely, the first honest words he'd spoken in months of cruelty. Can't what? I asked, though I knew the answer already. Can't move them anymore. They're way too heavy for me. I nodded slowly, letting the uncomfortable silence stretch until it became almost unbearable between us. The men at my factory moved boxes twice this heavy every single day for 40 years straight. But they respected the work and understood its value. Mark looked up at me with new eyes, finally seeing something beyond the helpless old man he'd been tormenting and abusing. His education was progressing exactly as planned. I pulled out my collection of steel tools, wrenches, hammers, measuring devices that had served me through decades of honest, productive work. Clean and oil these properly, I instructed, setting them before Mark's exhausted form on the floor. His hands trembled as he lifted the first heavy wrench, the weight surprising him again completely. Grandpa, this stuff weighs a ton, he complained, but his voice lacked its usual arrogance and swagger. So do I replied quietly. But we both still have important work to do. He fumbled with the cleaning cloth, struggling to grip tools that had once felt natural in my experienced hands. Grease stained his soft fingers, and metal scraped against his tender palms painfully. Every tool taught him something about the hands that had raised him, fed him, provided for him while he'd offered nothing but disrespect and cruelty in return. His education was becoming physical now, written in sweat and blood on his pampered hands. An hour of cleaning tools left Mark with bleeding palms and a deeper understanding of manual labor's reality. He slammed down a heavy wrench and looked at me with something approaching desperation and defeat. Why are you making me do this stuff? For the first time, his voice carried genuine curiosity instead of anger and resentment. I leaned forward on my walking stick, meeting his eyes directly and seriously. Because you threw my cane in the fire and thought that made you stronger than me somehow. The words hit him like physical blows to his ego. His face went pale as the connection finally formed in his mind clearly. This wasn't random punishment or old man crankiness. This was justice, measured and delivered with the precision of a craftsman who understood both tools and consequences perfectly. Mark's mouth opened, but no sound emerged as the weight of his actions settled on his young shoulders like a heavy burden. Mark stammered his first attempt at a real apology. I didn't think it was important or anything. It was just wood to me. His voice cracked like a boy's, not the man he'd pretended to be for months. For the first time since he'd thrown my walking stick into the flames, I saw genuine fear and regret in his eyes instead of arrogance. But words came cheap after actions spoke so loudly and clearly. I reached into my tool chest and withdrew another walking stick, this one darker and heavier than all the others. This one, I said, placing it in his trembling hands carefully, was made from steel core oak. I built it thinking I might need to defend myself someday against someone. Mark's eyes widened as he felt the true weight of craftsmanship and deadly purpose. You made this yourself? I nodded slowly and seriously. I made all of them with these hands. And you burned one like it was worthless garbage. The lesson was sinking in deep, changing him from the inside out. The steel core walking stick sagged in Mark's grip, too heavy for his untrained arms to hold steady for long. I watched him struggle with the weight, not just of the cane, but of understanding what he'd destroyed so carelessly. Real strength isn't about muscle alone, I explained, taking the stick back easily with one hand. It's about respect for the work, respect for the tools, respect for the people who came before you and built everything. Mark nodded wordlessly, his usual defiance completely gone and defeated. Sweat and exhaustion had stripped away his false confidence, leaving behind a confused boy who was finally ready to learn proper lessons. But his education wasn't complete yet by any means. Words and demonstrations were good starts, but real change required consequences that lasted longer than workshop lessons and temporary embarrassment. Mark needed to understand that actions had serious prices, and his bill was still being calculated with interest added daily. At dinner, I told Melissa everything. This time with Mark sitting right beside her, unable to escape the reckoning he deserved. I described the walking stick burning, the forced chores, the complete disrespect I'd endured while she made excuses for his terrible behavior. Mark's head hung lower with each detail, his appetite gone as his mother's face shifted from confusion to horror to burning anger. Mark, is this true? Melissa's voice carried authority I hadn't heard in years of parenting. He nodded miserably, finally understanding that his actions had consequences beyond his grandfather's workshop and games. All of it, he whispered shamefully. Melissa stared at her son as if seeing a stranger, and perhaps she was seeing him clearly. The boy she'd been protecting had become someone who tormented elderly family members for sport. Her failure as a parent was laid bare at our dinner table, and she couldn't make excuses anymore or pretend it wasn't happening. That weekend, I invited Mrs. Henderson and 3 other neighbors for coffee. The same people who'd watched me shovel snow alone while Mark played games inside the warm house. Over cups and polite conversation, I told them exactly what had happened to my walking stick and why I'd been doing his chores like a servant. Mark's face went bright red as understanding murmurs filled our living room with judgment. These were people who'd known him since childhood, who'd watched him grow from cute boy to entitled teenager over the years. Their disappointment was visible and cutting, their whispered comments cutting deeper than any lecture I could deliver to him. Such a shame, Mrs. Henderson said loud enough for Mark to hear clearly. I never would have expected this kind of behavior from such a nice family. Public humiliation accomplished what private punishment couldn't. It made Mark's behavior real in the eyes of people whose opinions actually mattered to him socially. The change in Mark was immediate and dramatically visible to everyone who knew him. Without being asked, he began shoveling the driveway each morning before school started. He carried groceries from my car without complaint, polished my shoes until they gleamed perfectly, and even volunteered to help with workshop projects on weekends. Every action was quieter, humbler, performed with the careful attention of someone who finally understood consequences and their weight. I watched this transformation with mixed feelings, satisfaction at justice served properly, but sadness that it had required such harsh lessons to reach him effectively. The cocky boy who'd burned my walking stick was gone completely, replaced by someone who moved through our house like he was walking on thin ice constantly. Good. Thin ice taught respect for solid ground in ways that solid ground never could teach anyone. His education was complete, but the lessons would last forever in his memory. One evening, as Mark swept the workshop floor without being asked or reminded, I decided it was time for our final conversation about everything. You threw my walking stick in the fire thinking it would make me weak somehow, I said, settling into my chair with the steel core cane across my lap. But all you did was give me reason to show you who I really am underneath. He stopped sweeping and looked at me with eyes that held genuine tears of regret. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I'm really sorry about everything. The words came from somewhere deeper than before, carrying weight that his earlier apologies had completely lacked. I studied his face for a long moment, searching for traces of the arrogant boy who tormented me for months. He was still there, but buried now under layers of hard-won wisdom and respect. Sorry is a good start, I said finally. But respect is earned through consistent action, not just words or promises. Over the following weeks, Mark proved his transformation was genuine and lasting change, not temporary guilt. He researched walking stick craftsmanship online and asked if I'd teach him to carve properly with my tools. He apologized to the neighbors who'd witnessed his behavior, taking full responsibility without making excuses or blaming others. Most importantly, he began treating me like a person worthy of respect rather than a servant to command and abuse. The workshop became our meeting place, where grandfather and grandson worked side by side on projects that required both experience and youthful enthusiasm together. I taught him to use tools properly, to respect their power and purpose, to understand that real strength came from skill and patience rather than just youth and raw muscle. The boy who'd once thrown my independence into the fire was learning to build rather than destroy everything around him. His hands were learning to create instead of taking away from others. Months later, as we sat in the workshop admiring the walking stick Mark had carved under my careful guidance, I reflected on how completely our relationship had changed for the better. The entitled teenager was gone forever, replaced by a young man who understood that respect flowed in all directions properly. I'll never forget what I did to you, he said quietly, running his fingers along the smooth oak grain he'd shaped. Good, I replied honestly. The best lessons are the ones that stay with you forever and change who you are. My revenge hadn't been about breaking Mark's spirit completely. It had been about forging it into something stronger and more valuable to society. The walking stick he'd burned had been replaced by something more important. A grandson who finally understood that strength without respect was just bullying, and that real power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down cruelly. The fire that consumed my cane had ultimately lit the path to Mark's redemption, and that was worth every moment of pain and careful planning. Sometimes the hardest lessons create the strongest foundations.